If you want him to stay, Ethan, you're going to have to accept that this isn't just your marriage anymore. That was the sentence my wife said to me while standing in the living room of the house I had been paying for, her wedding ring still on her finger, her voice calm like she was negotiating something as ordinary as a cable bill, not redefining the foundation of our life together, and the man she was talking about wasn't hypothetical, he was standing right behind her, leaning against the doorway like he had already been invited in long before I ever realized what was happening. His name was Daniel, her coworker, the one she used to mention casually over dinner, the one she said just understood her better, the one who somehow went from being a name in a story to a presence in my home, and I remember the exact detail that stuck with me in that moment. It wasn't the way she avoided eye contact, it wasn't even the way he didn't bother to introduce himself. It was the fact that she said it like I was the last person to be informed, like a decision had already been made and I was just being handed the terms, and for a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood, that maybe this was some kind of test or a joke that hadn't landed right, but then she stepped closer, lowered her voice just enough to sound reasonable, and repeated it, slower this time, like she was explaining something to someone who needed help catching up, and that's when I realized this wasn't sudden, this wasn't impulsive, this had been building, quietly, carefully, right in front of me while I was still thinking we were just going through a rough patch like every other couple, 5 years of marriage, 5 years of shared routines, shared bills, shared plans, and somehow I had missed the moment where I stopped being her partner and became an obstacle she was trying to work around, and the truth is, I had seen the signs, I just didn't put them together fast enough, the late nights that didn't quite add up, the way her phone was always face down now, the way she started comparing me to people I had never met, always indirectly, always framed like advice, like I should want to be better, like I should want to be more like the kind of man she suddenly respected, and every time I asked about it, she had an answer ready, calm, controlled, reasonable, the kind of answers that make you question your own instincts instead of her behavior, and that's how it happens, not all at once, but in small adjustments that slowly move the line until one day you're standing in your own living room being told there's someone else in your marriage and you're the only one who didn't see it coming, and I wish I could say I reacted the way people expect, that I raised my voice, that I told him to leave, that I drew a line right there in that moment, but I didn't. I stood there, listening, watching, letting her explain the rules of something I never agreed to, and the more she talked, the more confident she sounded, like she had already measured my response and found it lacking, like she knew exactly how far she could push before I pushed back, and that was the part that stayed with me, not the betrayal, not even the humiliation, but the certainty in her voice, the assumption that I didn't have a move left to make, that whatever control I thought I had over my own life, my own home, my own marriage, was already gone, and what she didn't know, what neither of them knew standing there in that room, was that I wasn't trying to win that conversation, I wasn't even trying to stop what was already happening, because somewhere between the first time she mentioned his name and the moment she asked me to accept him, I had already started paying attention in a different way, and by the time she finished explaining their version of our future, I wasn't confused anymore, I wasn't even angry, I was just very, very clear on one thing, this wasn't the moment I was losing everything, this was the moment they started walking into something they didn't understand yet. The next morning, nothing felt dramatic. And that was the strangest part, because after a moment like that, you expect something to break, voices raised, doors slammed, some kind of visible damage that proves everything has changed, but instead the house felt exactly the same. The coffee maker clicked on at 6:30 like it always did, the sunlight came through the same kitchen window, and Olivia moved through the space like nothing about the previous night required reflection or apology. She greeted me with the same casual tone, asked if I wanted coffee, and for a second I almost answered out of habit before I realized what she was doing. She was normalizing it, turning something that should have been impossible into something routine, something that could exist without being questioned. And Daniel was there too, not in the background this time, not as a visitor waiting for permission, but sitting at the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone like he had already memorized the layout of the place, like he had been there long enough to feel comfortable. And that was when I understood that what happened the night before was not a beginning, it was a reveal. This had already been happening, just without my awareness. And the version of my life I thought I was protecting had already been adjusted to include someone else, and I could see the pattern now, the way Olivia moved, the way she spoke, even the way she avoided looking directly at me for too long, it was all controlled, measured, like she had rehearsed this transition in her head until it felt natural, and the part that would have made most people react was not the presence of another man, it was the way she expected me to adapt without resistance. Like my role in all of this was to quietly accept the new arrangement and find a way to exist around it, and I watched her closely that morning, not with anger, but with clarity, because once you stop trying to fix something, you start seeing it for what it actually is. She was not unsure, she was not conflicted, she was certain that this was better, certain that this was justified, and most importantly, certain that I would not do anything about it, and that certainty came from somewhere. It came from weeks, maybe months of testing boundaries, of pushing slightly and watching me step back instead of forward, of making small changes and realizing there were no consequences, and now she had reached the point where she believed she could redefine everything without losing anything, and Daniel, he followed that same confidence. He did not challenge her, he reinforced her, he laughed at the right moments, nodded when she spoke, positioned himself like someone who had already replaced me without having to say it out loud, and I let it all play out, every detail, every assumption, every silent agreement between them, because reacting in that moment would have only confirmed what they already believed, that I was predictable, that I would either argue or leave, and both outcomes would have made their situation easier, cleaner, simpler, but I was not interested in making anything easier for them, so I sat down at the same table I had sat at for years, poured my coffee, and listened, not to what they were saying, but to what they were revealing, the language they used, the way they framed things, the small slips that people make when they think they are in control. And that was when everything started to connect, the timeline, the access, the decisions that had been made without me being fully aware of their impact, and it was not just about my marriage anymore, it was about something larger that they did not realize they were part of, something that extended beyond this house, beyond this conversation, and the more I listened, the more certain I became that this situation was not as one-sided as they believed, because what Olivia did not know, what Daniel definitely did not know, was that I had already started asking questions long before either of them thought I was paying attention, and the answers I found were not just about them, they were about where this was all leading, and by the time Olivia finished explaining how she wanted things to work moving forward, I had already decided that I was not going to stop them, I was going to let them continue exactly as they planned. Because sometimes the fastest way to understand the full picture is to let people believe they are getting everything they want, and that was the moment I stopped seeing myself as someone reacting to what was happening, and started seeing exactly how much of this I could control without them ever realizing it. By the end of that week, Daniel was no longer a guest in the house, and that distinction mattered more than anything else because guests wait to be invited and they leave when it is appropriate, but Daniel stopped doing both, he stopped asking and he stopped leaving, his jacket hung over the same chair every morning, his shoes sat by the door like they belonged there, and the small details started stacking up in ways that would have driven most people to react. The kind of quiet invasions that are easy to ignore individually but impossible to ignore once you see the pattern. He knew where everything was, he poured his own coffee without hesitation, he adjusted the thermostat like he had equal say in the comfort of a place he had not built, and Olivia encouraged all of it without ever directly acknowledging what it meant. She framed everything like progress, like evolution, like something modern and healthy that I just needed time to understand. And what she did not realize was that I was not struggling to understand it. I was studying it, because every action, every assumption, every small shift in behavior was giving me information, and information was the only thing that mattered now, not emotion, not confrontation, not even the relationship itself, because once a situation reaches this point, reacting emotionally only limits what you can see, and I needed to see everything. I needed to understand how far they were willing to go and how confident they were in their position, and that confidence kept growing. Daniel started staying overnight without asking, then multiple nights in a row, and eventually there was no difference between when he arrived and when he left because there was no longer a clear boundary, and Olivia treated it like a natural adjustment, like something we had all silently agreed to. She would talk about schedules, about work, about weekend plans, including him in conversations that used to belong to us. And the way she did it was careful, she never said anything directly disrespectful, she never framed it as replacing me, but the implication was always there, always just beneath the surface, and that is what made it more effective, because it forced me into a position where Reacting would make me look unreasonable, like I was the one refusing to adapt, and I could see exactly how that narrative would play out if I followed it, how it would isolate me, how it would justify their choices, and that was not a position I was going to give them, so I stayed consistent, calm, observant. I asked simple questions when necessary, I answered when spoken to, but I did not engage beyond that. And the less I reacted, the more they relaxed, the more they believed their version of reality was stable, and that was when the real mistakes started happening, the kind of mistakes people only make when they think there are no consequences. Olivia started sharing more than she realized, small comments about work, about internal changes at the company, about decisions being made at higher levels that she did not fully understand but assumed were temporary. And Daniel, he talked even more. He talked about projects, about access, about opportunities he thought were opening up for him, and the way he spoke made one thing very clear: he believed he was moving up, not just in his career, but in every aspect of his life, and he believed Olivia was part of that progression, like the two of them were building something together, something better than what she had before. And I listened to all of it, every detail, every assumption, every misplaced confidence, because what they did not know, what neither of them had taken the time to question, was how much of what they were describing was already connected to decisions that had been made long before they ever thought they were in control. And the more they talked, the clearer it became that they were operating inside a structure they did not understand, making plans based on information they only partially had. And that was the moment everything shifted for me, because it confirmed what I had suspected. This was not just about betrayal, it was about timing, about position, about who actually had influence over what was coming next. And while they were getting more comfortable, more confident, more certain that they had already won, I was getting closer to understanding exactly how and when that certainty would start to fall apart. It did not take long before subtle disrespect turned into something more deliberate, something public, something designed to test how far they could go without consequence. And the first time it happened outside the house was at a small gathering Olivia insisted we attend, a casual dinner with a few of her coworkers. The kind of setting where everything looks polite on the surface but every word carries weight if you know how to listen. And Daniel was there, of course, not introduced as anything unusual, just another familiar presence, but the way Olivia positioned him, the way she spoke to him, the way she included him in conversations while leaving me on the edge of them, it was clear this was not accidental, it was staged, controlled, and meant to send a message without ever saying it directly. And I watched as the room adjusted to that message, how people followed her lead, how they shifted their attention, how they treated Daniel like someone important and me like someone optional. And it was subtle enough that no one could call it out, but obvious enough that anyone paying attention could feel it. And that was the moment I realized this was no longer just about private choices, this was about perception, about rewriting roles in front of an audience. And Olivia leaned into that completely. She laughed a little louder when Daniel spoke, she referenced things they had done together at work. She even made a comment about how some people just understand growth better than others, and she said it while looking directly at me, not aggressively, not even with anger, but with a kind of quiet certainty that made it worse, because it meant she believed it. And Daniel followed her rhythm perfectly, adding small remarks, reinforcing her points, positioning himself as someone who belonged in that space beside her, and I could see the dynamic forming in real time. The narrative they were building, the way they were trying to establish something that looked natural to everyone else. And the more they did it, the more confident they became, because no one challenged it, no one questioned it, and to them, my silence looked like agreement, like acceptance, like weakness. And that assumption gave them permission to go further, to blur lines even more. And by the end of the night, it was no longer subtle, it was clear to anyone watching that I was no longer the center of that relationship, not in her eyes, not in the way she presented it. And that was exactly what she wanted, not just a new dynamic, but a visible one, something that redefined how people saw us, how they ranked us, how they understood who mattered and who did not. And I could feel the shift, not just in that room, but in the way she carried herself after, the way she spoke to me in the car on the way home, like she had proven something, like she had crossed a line and nothing had stopped her. And Daniel, he carried that same energy, that same quiet confidence of someone who believed he had stepped into a position he had earned. And for most people, that would have been the breaking point, the moment where pride takes over, where emotion forces a reaction. But I was not interested in reacting, because what they did not understand was that every step they took in that direction was making something else clearer for me, something they had not even considered, because while they were focused on controlling how things looked, I was focused on understanding how things actually worked, and the more they tried to elevate themselves in front of others, the more they exposed the exact points where that elevation could collapse, and that was when I stopped seeing their behavior as something to resist, and started seeing it as something that would eventually work against them in ways they were not prepared for. By the following week, what used to feel uncomfortable had turned into something else entirely, something colder, something more intentional, because it was no longer about testing boundaries, it was about proving that those boundaries did not exist anymore. And the way Olivia moved through the house made that clear. She no longer adjusted her behavior around me, she expected me to adjust around her. Conversations happened without including me, decisions were made without consulting me, and the routines we had built over years were quietly replaced with new ones that centered around her and Daniel. And what stood out the most was not just what she did, but what she assumed I would not do. She assumed I would not leave, she assumed I would not challenge her, and most importantly, she assumed I did not have any leverage left to change the situation, and that assumption shaped everything. It shaped the way she spoke to me, the way she dismissed small concerns, even the way she framed my silence as agreement instead of calculation. And Daniel followed that same pattern. His confidence grew in direct proportion to my lack of reaction. He started treating the space like it belonged to him, offering opinions about things that had nothing to do with him, making comments about finances, about plans, about what made sense for the future, and each time he spoke, it revealed something important, not about his confidence, but about his ignorance. Because the more comfortable he became, the more he exposed how little he actually understood about the structure he was stepping into, and that was when I realized something critical. They were not just underestimating me, they were overestimating their position. They believed they had already moved into something stable, something secure, when in reality they were standing on something temporary, something that could shift the moment the right pressure was applied. And that was when the situation stopped being emotional for me entirely. It became strategic. Every interaction, every conversation, every decision they made was data, and I started organizing it in my head, connecting it to what I already knew, to what I had already confirmed through quiet conversations, through documents most people would not think to question, through relationships that existed outside the narrow world Olivia thought she understood, and the more I connected those pieces, the clearer the picture became. Because what she did not know, what Daniel definitely did not know, was that their confidence was built on access they did not control, opportunities they did not create, and a system that had rules they had never taken the time to understand. And the moment that system shifted, everything they thought they had secured would disappear just as quietly as it had appeared, and I could see exactly where that shift would come from, not through confrontation, not through arguments, but through something far more effective, timing, because timing is what separates reaction from control. And while they believed they were moving forward without resistance, I was waiting for the exact moment when their momentum would carry them into a situation they could not adjust to, and that moment was closer than they realized, because the same company they talked about every day, the same place where Daniel believed his future was expanding, was already moving in a direction neither of them had accounted for, and I had been aware of that direction long before either of them thought to pay attention. And as I watched them settle into what they believed was their new normal, I understood something with absolute clarity. They were not taking anything from me, they were stepping into something that was about to change in a way that would cost them far more than they ever expected. The first real shift did not come from an argument or a confrontation, it came from a conversation Olivia thought was insignificant, the kind of passing comment people make when they believe the person listening does not understand the full context. She was standing in the kitchen one evening talking to Daniel about a meeting that had gone better than expected, something about leadership restructuring, something about departments being evaluated, and the way she described it told me everything I needed to know, not just about what was happening, but about what she thought it meant. She believed it was an opportunity, she believed it was growth, she believed it was a sign that people like her and Daniel were being noticed, and Daniel leaned into that idea immediately, talking about potential promotions, about visibility, about how timing was finally on their side, and I let them talk. I let them build that narrative out loud, because what they were describing was real, but their interpretation of it was completely wrong, and that was the difference between knowing something and understanding it. They had access to information, but they did not have the perspective to see where that information actually led, and that was when I realized the moment I had been waiting for was already in motion, because the restructuring they were excited about was not designed to elevate people like them, it was designed to consolidate control, to remove inefficiencies, to tighten oversight in ways that most employees never see until it is too late, and the reason I knew that was not because I worked there, not because Olivia had told me, but because I had been part of the conversations that set that process in motion long before it reached her level, conversations that never appeared in internal emails, never got discussed in casual meetings, conversations that happened behind closed doors with people who did not need to explain themselves to anyone inside the company. And Olivia had no idea those conversations existed. Daniel definitely did not. To them, the company was just a place of employment, a structure they operated within, but to me, it was something I understood from a completely different angle, something I had been connected to long before either of them ever walked through its doors, and I remember the exact moment everything aligned. Olivia mentioned a name, a senior executive who was supposedly leading the restructuring effort, and she said it with a kind of casual confidence, like she had direct insight into decisions that were still being finalized, and that was when I knew she was only seeing the surface, because that name was not the one making the final calls, not even close, it was just the name being used to manage perception internally, and Daniel nodded like it confirmed everything he believed, like he was already positioning himself for whatever came next. And that was when I understood how complete the gap was between what they thought was happening and what was actually happening, and that gap was where everything would change, because what Olivia did not know, what she never thought to question, was how those decisions were approved, who signed off on them, who had the authority to redefine entire departments with a single directive, and more importantly, who had the ability to decide who stayed and who did not when those changes took effect, and the answer to that question was not someone she had ever met, not someone Daniel could impress, not someone they could influence through proximity or confidence, and as I listened to them plan their future inside a system they did not control, I realized something that made everything else irrelevant. They were not just building on unstable ground, they were building on ground that was about to be reassigned entirely, and the most important part, the part that would matter when everything shifted, was not what they had done to me, it was the fact that they had tied themselves to something that I already had a role in shaping, and the moment that role became visible, the entire structure they thought they were stepping into would look very different from where they were standing. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, printed on thick white paper with the company logo embossed in a way that made it feel more important than any email announcement, and Olivia walked in holding it like it confirmed everything she had been saying for weeks, her voice lighter, sharper, almost triumphant as she told Daniel it was a closed executive meeting, the kind of meeting people like them did not usually get invited to unless something significant was happening. And Daniel reacted exactly how I expected, a mix of excitement and validation, like this was the moment he had been working toward, the moment that proved he was no longer just another employee, and they talked about it right there in the living room, not even lowering their voices, already planning what it meant, what positions might open up, who might get moved, who might get pushed out, and how this could change everything for them, and I listened from across the room, quiet, still, letting every assumption settle into place. Because this was the stage being set, not by me, but by them. And the more they talked, the more confident they became. Olivia even mentioned that her manager hinted at new leadership direction, and Daniel immediately framed it as opportunity, as advancement, as something they could step into together, and that was when I knew the timing was exact, because what they saw as an invitation up was actually the beginning of a filter, something designed to separate people based on criteria they did not even realize existed, and the meeting itself, the one they were so focused on attending, was not about giving people power, it was about identifying who already had it and who did not. And neither of them had ever questioned where that line was drawn, because from their perspective, influence came from visibility, from proximity, from being noticed in the right rooms, but they had never considered that the real decisions were made long before those rooms were even prepared, and that was where everything changed, because while they were preparing to walk into that meeting thinking they were stepping forward, I already knew exactly what that meeting was meant to reveal, not just to them, but to everyone involved, and the days leading up to it only reinforced that understanding. Olivia started dressing differently, speaking differently, carrying herself like someone who had already been chosen, and Daniel mirrored that shift, more confident at home, more certain in his tone, even making comments about how things were about to look very different, and each time he said it, I could hear the certainty in his voice. The belief that he had already secured something that had not even been decided yet, and that certainty was the final piece I needed, because people only expose their true position when they believe it cannot be challenged, and by the night before the meeting, everything was exactly where it needed to be. They were confident, they were aligned, and they were completely unaware of how little control they actually had over what was coming next. And as Olivia placed the invitation on the kitchen counter like it was a symbol of everything she thought she had gained, I looked at it once, not for the date, not for the location, but for the confirmation it represented, because that same meeting, the one they believed would elevate them, was something I had already been connected to in ways they had never even considered, and for the first time since all of this started, the timeline was no longer uncertain, it was fixed, and the moment they walked into that room expecting one outcome was the exact moment everything would begin to shift in a direction they were not prepared for. The morning of the meeting felt different, not because anything in the house had changed, but because of the way Olivia carried herself as she got ready, every movement precise, every choice intentional, like she was stepping into a version of her life she had already accepted as real, and Daniel matched that energy, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror like he was about to walk into a promotion instead of a review, and neither of them looked at me as they left, not out of guilt, but because I no longer factored into the version of the future they had constructed, and that was exactly why I let them go first, because timing mattered, and being early was not the same as being ready, and by the time I arrived at the building, the lobby was already filled with people who had the same invitation, the same assumptions, the same quiet confidence that comes from believing you are about to move forward, and I watched them for a moment before stepping inside, the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves, all of it familiar, all of it predictable, because I had seen this before, not from the outside, but from the side that understood how these moments were designed. And when I walked into the conference room, the first thing I noticed was not the layout or the seating, it was the silence that settled just slightly as I entered, not because they recognized me, but because I did not fit the pattern they expected. I was not part of their internal hierarchy, not someone they could place immediately, and that uncertainty always creates space, and I took my seat at the far end of the table, not drawing attention, not avoiding it either, just present, and it did not take long before Olivia and Daniel walked in. Their conversation stopping mid-sentence the moment they saw me there, not because they understood why, but because something about it did not align with the story they had been telling themselves. Olivia's expression shifted first, a brief hesitation, quickly masked, but still there, still real, and Daniel followed, his confidence adjusting into something more cautious, something that had to recalculate, and I said nothing. I did not acknowledge them, I did not need to, because the room itself was about to do that for me, and when the meeting began, it started exactly how they expected: presentations, summaries, discussions about restructuring and future direction, all the language that creates the illusion of inclusion, the sense that everyone in the room has a role in what comes next, and I watched as they relaxed again, as Olivia took notes, as Daniel leaned forward, engaging, believing this was their moment to be seen, to be recognized, and then the shift came, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way the conversation narrowed, in the way certain names were called, certain roles were clarified, and the focus moved from discussion to decision, and that was when the real structure revealed itself, because this was never about asking for input, it was about announcing outcomes, and one by one, departments were addressed, positions were redefined, and the language changed from opportunity to alignment, from growth to necessity, and I could see it in their faces when the realization started to form, when the certainty they had built began to fracture, because this was not what they expected, not even close, and then it reached the point where everything aligned. Exactly as I knew it would, the moment where authority is no longer implied but demonstrated, and a senior executive paused, glanced down at the documents in front of him, and then toward me, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with recognition, and that was the moment the entire room shifted, because what Olivia and Daniel did not know, what they had never even considered, was that the decisions being announced were not just approved at a higher level, they were tied to someone sitting quietly in the same room they had just walked into believing they understood, and when my name was acknowledged in that context, not as an employee, not as a participant, but as someone directly connected to the authority behind the restructuring. Everything they thought they had built collapsed in silence, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through a single moment of clarity they were not prepared to face. The room did not erupt, there were no raised voices, no dramatic reactions, just a shift so quiet it felt heavier than anything louder could have been, because once my name was said in that context, everything recalibrated at once, not just for Olivia and Daniel, but for everyone in that room who suddenly understood there was a layer they had not seen before. And I did not move, I did not explain, I did not need to, because the documents being presented, the decisions being outlined, all carried the same signature of authority they had never thought to question. And I could feel Olivia's attention without looking at her, the way people look when something they believed completely is being replaced in real time. And Daniel, he stopped leaning forward, his posture changing into something more uncertain, something that had to process a reality that did not match the one he had been building. And the meeting continued, structured, controlled, each department addressed, each role clarified, and when it reached theirs, it was not framed as opportunity, it was framed as alignment, positions consolidated, redundancies identified, expectations redefined, and the language was precise, neutral, but final. And that was the moment their assumptions fully collapsed. Not because of what was said directly, but because of what it meant, because the future they had been planning depended on access they no longer had, influence they never actually controlled, and a system that had already moved past them without ever needing their approval. And I let it happen exactly as it was designed to, no interruption, no interference, because this was never about taking something from them. It was about allowing reality to replace the version they had constructed. And when the meeting ended, people stood, conversation started quietly, the usual attempts to process what had just been announced, but Olivia did not move immediately. She stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary, like she was trying to find a way to reframe what she had just heard. And Daniel looked at her, not confident anymore, not certain, just waiting. And that was when I finally stood, not toward them, not away from them, just up, because the moment had already passed, and anything said after would only reduce it. And as I walked toward the door, I felt her step closer behind me, her voice lower now, controlled but no longer certain, asking a question she had never needed to ask before. How long had I known? And I paused just enough to acknowledge it without turning, because the answer was not complicated, it was simply something she had never considered. And I told her the truth, that I had known long enough to understand that what they thought they were building was never theirs to begin with. And I left it there, no explanation, no detail, because none of that would change what had already happened. And as I walked out of that building, the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had been revealed, settled into something clear and final, not a victory, not a loss, just a correction, a realignment of what was always there beneath the surface. And by the time I got back to the house later that day, it felt different in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or space, because the illusion that had been living there was gone, replaced by something quieter, more honest. And when Olivia came back hours later, there was no performance left in her voice, no certainty, no attempt to control the narrative, just silence and the understanding that the position she thought she had secured no longer existed. And I did not need to say anything else, because the same calm that had been mistaken for weakness from the beginning was the only thing left. And it was enough, because some endings do not require noise, they only require the truth to be seen clearly once, and after that, everything else falls into place on its own. And sometimes, the truth doesn't show up until it's already too late. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.